So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Royal Society, to this evening's event. It's just wonderful to have you all back in person. This is my first time back as a fellow in this society. I'm sure it's Tim's as well, in more than 18 months. So it's just lovely to be back in this great space. And of course, we've been, as you all know, variously affected by this thing called the virus, COVID-19, and we've just had our 450th, as you know. Our events have been, in some sense, modulated. We've had huge success in having digital lectures and events which have had very wide reach. We've been able to reach all parts of the globe, of course. But there's nothing like getting together and sharing ideas and the excitement and the thrill of learning and discovering together. So tonight we're going to be hearing a very special lecture around the tube alloys project. Tim has been spending some time getting to the bottom of this very intriguing research effort that featured Jesus College, as we'll hear. But just let me say just a few words. Tim is absolutely certain I shouldn't spend any time at all on describing his accomplishments, but let me just tell you that Professor Tim Palmer is Royal Society Research Professor in Climate Physics, and he is co-director of the Oxford Martin School on Modelling. Tim has written and predicting climate and a professorial fellow at Jesus College, most importantly. We're fortunate to have him. He has done huge amounts of important work, chaired IPCC panels. His work on climate modelling is widely cited. In fact, just today, that whole field was recognised with the award of a Nobel for some of the seminal early work in climate modelling, which is as it should be. This is an existential challenge facing us. With all those accomplishments behind him, and they are substantial, he also worries about how we can compute these climate models efficiently, energetically, efficiently, with what's called inexact computing techniques. So he has many areas in which our interests coincide. He has won many prizes, apart from being a fellow of this place. He's also won the Dirac Gold Medal for the Institute of Physics. He's a fellow and top prizes of a number of institutions, not least international member of the US National Academy of Sciences. So Tim's going to talk for around 45 minutes, then we'll take some Q&A. I know it's going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm thrilled to welcome Tim to the stage. Tim, please tell us about the Tube Alloys project.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as Nigel says, it's nice actually to get out for a change. So I guess everyone's familiar with the Bletchley Park secret project. Led by Alan Turing, deciphered the Enigma code. Fantastic success. Historians reckon it shortened the war by two or more years. I'm going to talk about a project which was much less successful than that. Let me just start by, some of you who've been to the college may have seen the plaque outside what's now the undergraduate Merrick Library, saying that this was actually the place where the college had a science laboratory, chemistry laboratory of its own. I believe it was the last independent college science lab of this sort. And during the war, it took part in this secret atom bomb project called Tube Alloys. So that's what I want to talk about, Tube Alloys project. What was it? How did it come about? And importantly, what were the ramifications of this project? Now, I want to start by introducing and I hope I'm not offending anyone tonight, but I'm going to call the villain of the piece. What essentially made this project pretty much, I would say, a disaster for the UK. And I believe it has ramifications, certainly had major ramifications in the post-war years, and arguably has ramifications to the present day. So that's what I want to talk a bit about, this post-tube alloys as well. As Nigel says, I should sort of explain, I myself am not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. My main field's in climate physics. There is a curious, I'll finish with a curious connection to climate physics at the end, climate science. I got interested in this topic because of the book by Graham Farmiloe called Churchill's Bomb. And I got interested in that book because I had read previously his biography of Dirac. Dirac was actually my supervisor's supervisor, so I have a sort of a slight family connection, as it were, academic at least, family connection to Paul Dirac, who's reckoned to be, perhaps after Isaac Newton, our greatest physicist. So really it was this sort of connection through Farmiloe's original book that I got interested, and then got particularly interested when I noticed that Jesus College had actually played a role in this tube alloys project. I do want to thank a number of people, Robin Darwell-Smith, the college archivist, who's uncovered some interesting material. Gordon Hardwick, who's the son of Bill Hardwick, who was one of the scientists working in tube alloys during the war at the college. Colin Hayden, who's a historian at the college. And Bill Hayes, who was a physicist who actually knew Lindemann that I spoke to. He's now in his 90s. Okay, so that's sort of the background. So let me just dive straight in. I think the story starts at what could be called the sort of zenith of the British Empire in 1897. And the British Empire and all the Industrial Revolution that came before it was basically built on coal. The fact that apparently the UK had as much coal under its ground as Saudi Arabia has oil. So coal played a major part in the British Empire, clearly. And coal, up until this moment, all forms of energy, whether it's wood or coal or oil or anything, derive their ultimate source from the sun. So coal comes from the fact that the sun allows trees to grow, the trees decay, they get buried underground, they become fossil carbon. But ultimately, so all forms of energy pretty much up to this time, derived from the sun. But the year before 1896, the French physicist Henri Becquerel, discovered a source of energy that's not linked to the sun. And he did this somewhat serendipitously. He had a piece of what was called pitch blende, or sometimes called uraninite, because people knew at the time that it was composed of an element called uranium, being discovered actually in the 18th century. And what Becquerel discovered was that if you, and as I say, somewhat fortuitously, I think, if you stuck a piece of this thing in a cupboard, close the drawer, no sunlight got to it, and put a photographic plate in, the photographic plate would get fogged. And not only that, if you kept it in there for a week, a fortnight, a month, it would still fog the photographic plate with the same intensity that it had before. So it wasn't like, it had been out in the sun for a couple of days, storing up a bit of solar energy and then giving that off subsequently. It was something inherent in the substance that was giving off energy, some form of light beams that were fogging photographic plate. And people realised that this must be something inherently in the structure of pitch blende, something in the atoms that was causing this energy to arise. And this actually caught the public's attention enormously, and none more so than the science fiction writer H.G. Wells. And he, in his book, The World Set Free in 1914, actually talks about using this form of energy for weapons. He actually coins the phrase, the atom bomb, after this discovery by Becquerel. However, the scientists at the time were very dismissive of this idea. So this is Ernest Rutherford, who at the time, I think when H.G. Wells had written his book, Rutherford had already won a Nobel Prize, but he was the world's leading experimental physicist. And he basically scotched these ideas. The suggestion of Mr. Wells must be considered as a dream for the future, not the slightest evidence for the feasibility of atomic bombs. So basically the science community was saying, look, you science fiction writers, you're sort of getting ahead of yourself, you're extrapolating, this stuff may be producing some energy, but there's nothing, that we're going to be able to harness in any serious way from this. So that was the view, let's say, in the early 20th century into the 1920s. Rutherford took up a position in Cambridge in, I think, 1919, and subsequently, Cambridge became the place. He was utterly preeminent in the world of experimental physics, and numerous groundbreaking discoveries about the structure of the atom and the nucleus were made in Cambridge. None more so than by his student James Chadwick, who in 1932 discovered the neutron. So just to remind you, if you like, an atom is comprised of a nucleus, a little small nucleus at the centre of the atom with electrons. These are small negatively charged particles whizzing around. At the time, before Chadwick, people thought that the nucleus was comprised of protons, which are positively charged, and electrons, which actually cancel some of the charges of the protons. But Chadwick discovered that actually there was a separate particle called the neutron. So neutrally charged, it wasn't positive or negatively charged. And that kind of basically cemented the standard view, which we have to the present day, of the structure of atoms. Well, neutrons are, because they're neutrally charged particles, they are not repulsed, unlike, say, a proton, they're not repulsed by the nucleus. So you can do experiments where you try to, inject or throw neutrons, project neutrons at the nucleus. And one of the leading scientists who took this on was a German called Otto Hahn, and his assistant Lisa Meitner, who was Austrian. And they were probably Hahn had a laboratory in Berlin, and they did some of the sort of prototypical experiments, bombarding atoms of uranium with neutrons, with the idea of trying to seeing even heavier nuclei could form, sort of what would happen. And they discovered, to their their complete bewilderment, that instead of producing these heavier atoms, they started to detect elements like barium. This is Ba symbol, which they couldn't figure out for a long time. Where's this barium coming from? We didn't start with barium. Where's it come from? In the late 30s, I forget the exact year, Lisa Meitner, who was Jewish, had to leave Germany because of the Nazis. She emigrated to Sweden, and there she started working with her nephew, another Otto Frisch. Could remember his name, he comes in later. And the two of them working together realized what was happening, and they coined this word fission, named pretty much after biology, cells sort of fissioning, splitting. They said that the uranium nucleus was splitting into two. This was a completely new idea at the time, and totally unexpected, but they realized that was the explanation of why she and Strassmann and Hahn in their lab in Berlin were seeing barium. The uranium atom was splitting. They also realized that extra neutrons were being produced in this process. Now, these two things together, and one thing to say is this splitting, this fissioning of the nucleus led to the release of energy, heat energy. So I think around this time, the late 30s, a number of scientists, people like Enrico Fermi, who was a very famous Italian physicist, realized there was the potential for this reaction to become a kind of chain reaction, whereby these neutrons that were given off could in turn split other uranium nuclei, and the whole thing would sort of start cascading, and you'd have potentially masses of energy released. Now, one of the, along with Fermi, one of these early people that realized this was a Hungarian-American physicist called Leocyld. And he quite famously went to see Einstein to try to get Einstein to write a letter to Roosevelt to alert him to the fact that uranium had this property that you could get a chain reaction, and in principle that chain reaction could produce a bomb. So in 1939, Szilard went to see Einstein at Princeton, and as a result of that, Einstein wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt basically saying, look, you know, America should be putting effort into building an atomic bomb. Now, let me give you the folk history of this. And when I say folk history, you may possibly, if you have access to, I think it's Netflix, it's either Netflix or Amazon Prime, it's one of those online channels. I think it is Netflix. There was a series called Uranium, it's sort of like 3 parts, very, very glossy. It was only made a year or 2 ago. And it gives you this is the folk history of the atom bomb. The folk history goes like this. Szilard goes to see Einstein, persuades Einstein to write the letter, which is what happened. Letter gets sent to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, oh, that's a good idea, we'll make a bomb. Set up the Manhattan Project. Okay? And the Manhattan Project was set up in Los Alamos, and hey presto, the bomb was produced. So that's the received wisdom. It's not at all like that. That is absolutely nothing to do with the truth. And the reason is that people who did the calculations at the time realized or calculated that the amount of uranium you'd need to actually get this chain reaction to occur is monstrously large, something around 40 tons of uranium. And it's completely unfeasible to build an atom bomb with 40 tons and put it in an aircraft and drop it on some country. It's a complete non-starter. So despite the fact Einstein had written this letter, most scientists, physicists at the time who were knowledgeable just scoffed at this idea. This is crazy. You never do it. It won't work. And indeed, you know, Roosevelt would have got advice in this area, and he would have said, look, this is interesting. We will keep tabs on it. But, you know, it's not something at the moment that seems to be feasible. So actually this letter didn't have the impact that these documentaries suggest that it did. Okay, so what happened then? Well, back in Britain, the physics department at Birmingham University was being run by an Australian physicist called Mark Oliphant, who plays a big role in this story. And Oliphant had recruited a number of German refugee physicists, typically with Jewish backgrounds. One, in fact, was Otto Frisch himself, and another was a guy called Rudolf Piles, and the 2 of them are in that photo in the bottom. So Piles had come over from Germany vehemently opposed to the Nazi government and wanting to do something to contribute in his way to the war against Nazi Germany. What he really wanted to do was actually work on radar, which was the big project at the time, but it was deemed by the powers that be that was much too sensitive a topic for him to work on, an untrustworthy German physicist. So Oliphant was basically ordered to give him something that wouldn't really, kind of keep him amused, but wouldn't do any serious damage. So he was given the task of looking into this atom bomb, this ridiculous 40 tons sort of thing. Oh, it'll keep him busy, keep him out of the way. So what happened then was Piles and Frisch together realized that this calculation of 40 tons was completely wrong, or could be, at least under circumstances, completely wrong. And the actual amount of material needed could be as low as somewhere between 1 and 10 kilograms. So a major change. And in March 1940, they wrote what's the famous Frisch-Piles memorandum, basically outlining that the perceived calculation of the critical mass needed to make an atom bomb had been massively overestimated. So let me give you a very simple, try to give you a very simple explanation of what was going on here. It became realized that, in fact, uranium occurs with 2 different isotopes. So an element is defined by the number of protons in the nucleus, but it can have different numbers of neutrons, and depending on, say 2 isotopes of an element would have the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. And there are 2 types of uranium that occur naturally, the so-called uranium-238. So that's when you sum together the protons and the neutrons, so 238 of them. That occurs for some 90-something% of uranium that you find naturally. And that actually isn't an isotope that itself splits. So you give it a neutron, it actually goes to a higher heavier type of nucleus called plutonium. We'll come on to plutonium in a minute. Plutonium does actually fissile, it breaks into 2, but uranium-238 by itself does not. But a very small percentage of uranium is what's called uranium-235, so the same number of protons but fewer neutrons. So that's the top one there, and that is the form of uranium that is fissile, that splits into barium and krypton. So basically, the Frisch and Pyle's memorandum was simply saying, if we could separate out uranium-235 and 238 and just focus on the uranium-235, how much would we need then to make an atom bomb? And that's where the 1 to 10 kilograms comes from. I was enormously happy some years ago now to meet Rudolf Pyles, actually here at the Royal Society, on the year he won what's called the Copley Medal, which is the Royal Society's top medal. I won a very minor prize. I'm just above him and to the right, in the days when I had a moustache. A little bit younger. But it was a fantastic honour. I mean, Pyles is a kind of superhero in this area. Okay, so then the question is, how do you separate? How would you actually go about separating these 2 isotopes? And there's yet another German physicist whose name was actually Fritz Simon, who then came over to England. His name got anglicised. He anglicised his name to Francis Simon. And he proposed a method which is that you can create a gas out of uranium, surprising as it may seem, by combining it with fluorine. So there's a thing called uranium hexafluoride. Uranium and 6 fluorine atoms form a gas. And Simon said, well, you could feed this gas into a sort of a container which had a sort of a semi-permeable membrane. So it just had little holes in it, which would preferentially, the uranium, the lighter isotope, 235, would diffuse through, leaving the heavier one outside. You'd have to kind of repeat this loads and loads and loads of times for it to really start to affect. But it's called gaseous diffusion. So separating out these 2, the lighter from the heavier form of uranium, by making it into a gas and then using a semi-permeable membrane to do it. So we have the 2 things now, the Frisch-Pyle memorandum, the Simon method of separating out the isotopes. So now the government, UK government, started to get interested, and there was a high-level committee which went under the name Maude, which sounds like an acronym, but I think it was just somebody's name or somebody's cousin's name or something. It doesn't really matter. The leading scientists and others in the field produced this. It's actually worth noting the dates here. So the Frisch-Pyle's memorandum was in 1940, March 1940. The Maude Committee took another year to make its report, but the basic conclusion was that it said we'd like to emphasise that at the beginning of this report we were very sceptical, but as we proceeded we became more and more convinced that the release of atomic energy on a large scale is possible. So with that, the tube alloys project started. So Maude sort of morphed into tube alloys. Tube alloys, the name was given by a gentleman called Wallace Akers, who I think was an industrialist from ICI, if I remember correctly. And he actually coined this name tube alloys. It was just a decoy phrase. It didn't mean anything, just to sort of throw people off the scent. But there's an interesting comment I'd like to make at the end about that. Now, this is where the college starts to get involved. Now, I haven't really been able to figure out why, exactly how the college got involved in this, but there are two interesting things. One is that Francis Simon was always complaining he'd never had enough lab space to do anything. So I guess if he found out that the college may have had something free, he would have, been up for using it. And the rather curious thing is that the guy, David Chapman, who was then in charge of the college lab, did his work on explosives, believe it or not. So, and in fact, even to this day, there is a part of an explosive wave, if you like, in gas, is called the Chapman-Yungay state. I think Chapman refers to him, and Yungay some other scientist that independently, I think, discovered this. So possibly Chapman said, "Look, I'm interested in things that go bang." And see, Simon's after some lab space for something that goes bang. So let's do it. So here, three names I've unearthed in this area that worked at the college during these early years, and I think they were originally all at undergraduate level. One was Bill Hardwick, whose son actually is here tonight. Robin McElroy and Lewis Roberts. Lewis actually became a fellow here at the Royal Society and subsequently was director of the Harwell lab, which I'll speak about a little bit later on. And they worked exactly on this problem of how to separate out these two isotopes of uranium using the process of gaseous diffusion of uranium hexafluoride. So that's Lewis Roberts in later years, probably when he was director of Harwell. Bill Hardwick, this looks a little bit blurred to me, the way it's projected, but he's at the bottom row on the right of the cricket captain in the middle of the Jesus cricket team in 1942. And those just happen to be photos of Lewis on his wedding day in 1949, and Bill, I don't know what year that would have been.
49.
49 as well. Okay, well that's interesting. One interesting thing I learnt is that Lewis's wife, Mary, had during the war worked at Bletchley Park, which is rather curious because both of them would have been sworn to utter secrecy in their own respective. I mean, did they really never say anything about that?
They really never did.
The mind boggles.
They never did.
They never did. I'm sure they didn't. I wasn't included. They did. Okay, so I'm going to leave them working on this problem of separating uranium because I want to sort of switch to what happened in the bigger world. Because what happened, so tube alloy started in August, I think it was at 41. That autumn, Mark Oliphant, who was the head of the physics department at Birmingham, went over to Washington to brief the Americans about the Maude Committee report and indeed this early work on tube alloys. I mean, they were allies, and he wanted to make sure they were aware of what was going on. So he would have spoke to Vannevar Bush, who was I don't think not related to either of the presidents, Bush, by the way. Who then was the most senior scientific administrator in the Roosevelt government, so director of the Office of Science, Research and Development. And then Bush would have gone to see Roosevelt to alert him of what had happened. And as a result of that, Roosevelt ordered Bush to draft a note to Churchill, which then Roosevelt would have sent as a personal note, proposing that Britain and the US work together to develop the Maude findings, and indeed the early work of tube alloys. And Roosevelt sent the message to Churchill suggesting that this project may be coordinated or even jointly conducted. So in some sense, he was, at this stage, Roosevelt was offering a kind of partnership for the two countries to work on this common problem. So Churchill receives the note from Roosevelt and asks Lindemann what he thinks. And Lindemann's view is, well, you know, he's read the Maude report as well. He's seen some of the early work, perhaps, that was starting on tube alloys. He says it's certain that this can be done, but he wanted it to be done in England, or perhaps at worst, as he says, at worst in Canada. But above all, we should not press the Americans to undertake this work. Okay, so what happens then is that Churchill responds to Roosevelt's offer with a perfunctory cable, saying, well, it'll be possible to meet the American representative in London, the American science representative in London, a man called Mr. Hovde, who will then relay some instructions back to America. I should say now, so a meeting was held on the 21st of November 1941, where the British side was represented by Lindemann and the minister responsible for tube alloys, whose name was John Anderson. And I think he's known for Anderson shelters, if you remember or know of them, the sort of bomb shelters that people used in their gardens and things. I think this date needs to be remembered because it's probably the last time we had discussions with the Americans where we were holding the trump cards. And I think we performed abysmally at this meeting. Farmelo describes the notes that Anderson's private secretary took of the meeting as excruciating, in the sense that both of these people, I've written at the end, their attitude was clearly supercilious and condescending. They said, we held all the trumps here, we don't need you Yanks, you can go home, no, thank you very much, but we're not interested. And even worse than that, Anderson said that we're not even going to collaborate with you until you improve your security. So it was on a par with Britain's. Now this is at a time when Philby, Maclean, Burgess, Blunt, Cairncross, Fuchs were leaking everything to the Russians. So this must go down in history as one of the worst meetings of the so-called special relationship of all time. I've been trying to get a feeling for what Lindemann was like, and this is where Bill Hayes came in. So I sent an email around to the physics department, and I got a reply from Mr. Hayes, Dr. Hayes, to say that he was a PhD student when Lindemann was still head of physics. And I said, what was he like, you know? I said, well, he said, look, one thing is he would turn up in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce at 11 o'clock in the morning, roughly. He would instruct his chauffeur to wait outside in the car whilst he went in and worked for somewhere between 1 and 1.5 hours, then got back in the chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce to be driven back to Christchurch College, where he had lunch and then retired for the rest of the day. So Lindemann was a strange fish. He was brought in by Oxford to somehow counter the preeminence of Cambridge and Rutherford. He was really a very second-rate scientist compared to Rutherford. And in fact, I think even to this day, this kind of vague feeling that still, you know, you hear from time to time that Cambridge is the place to go to do science and Oxford's the place to do humanities. This kind of brings back to these days of Lindemann versus Rutherford, where it was true that Lindemann was very much a second-rate person compared to Rutherford. Lindemann loved nothing more than hobnobbing with aristocracy, and it was actually through that he met Churchill. And, you know, for some reason Churchill liked him, and he became Churchill's science advisor during the war. And a lot of the other scientists said to Churchill, you're getting bad advice here. Lindemann, for example, didn't believe that radar would ever work. That's an example. He comes over as not an entirely nice person, and in fact, I found the ultimate quote about Lindemann, and this is from Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin, I should say, Isaiah Berlin was the president of Wolfson College, which is where I did my DPhil back in the 70s. I got to know Isaiah a little bit. I mean, he's a very nice guy. But, you know, he says, Lindemann is a genuinely horrible person. He's the only person I think whom I ever ardently wish to murder. So, okay, so that's about it. All right, so Jesus wasn't the only place where tube alloys work took place, and I think one of the major centres was a disused salt mine in North Wales called Reedy Newman, if that's the right pronunciation, which obviously was a more sizable effort. But basically they never came close to producing this critical mass of uranium-235. And one of the key reasons, actually, you can see, if you actually go back to the work at Jesus College, and this is from Lewis Roberts' DPhil thesis, which is basically on this tube alloys work. And if you read it, it talks about, you know, sort of the beginning properties of uranium hexafluoride UF6, but then you see down the problem of corrosion. The problem with this gas, it was highly corrosive, and it basically blocked up the membranes. It became so reactive with the metal in the membrane that it just blocked them up. And that was really the serious problem they had to overcome, the corrosion. So unfortunately, tube alloys didn't go anywhere. And then the big thing that happened at the end of 1941 was Pearl Harbor. And then America was in the war against both Japan and Germany. Werner Heisenberg was the preeminent German quantum physicist who stayed in Germany, and there was concern that he and his colleagues had the know-how to make a German atom bomb. So then the Americans went in. That's when Roosevelt, not the Szilard-Einstein letter, that's when Roosevelt got serious about it. And what does serious mean? Serious means that in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, they built, at the time, the biggest building in the world. So just think what the Leocyld Jenkins lab would look like. I mean, this is putting serious industrial capability. This is purely for the purpose of diffusing uranium-235 into uranium-238. Okay, so they realized this was a serious problem, a serious industrial problem. Even though we had solved the technical scientific work, they put the grunt work into actually doing it. So that was one thing. The other thing, if you remember, I talked about this second route to fission, which is that you breed, as it's called, plutonium. You build a reactor where you put uranium-238 in it, you bombard it with neutrons, it creates plutonium. And Fermi, who was based in Chicago at the time, oversaw the development of a nuclear reactor whose sole purpose was to produce plutonium. It wasn't to produce power, to produce plutonium. Farmlow has this rather, I don't know what the word is really, but sad, if you like, a statement in his book saying in 1944 Lindemann visited the sites of the Manhattan Project and perhaps appreciated for the first time how wrong he could have been to imagine that such an enormous venture could have been carried out in the UK. All right, so as we know, America exploded 2 bombs, one based on uranium-235 over Hiroshima, killed 66,000 people. The second one using the plutonium of the Hanford reactor in Washington, dropped on Nagasaki, killed 39,000 people. Historians still debate whether it was these or the Russian invasion of Manchuria that was actually the cause of the Japanese capitulation. So that's an open issue, and I'm not going to get into that, but just leave that as an open. Now, after the war, America signed what's called the McMahon Act, which basically restricted access to all nuclear information that it had developed as part of that Manhattan Project. So although there had been some scientists like Piles himself who worked in Los Alamos, you know, they would have had a very sort of restricted part of information. And the general information through this act was restricted, and it was restricted to Britain as well as to other countries. It's interesting, you know, to go, I managed to unearth some of the speeches that were made prior to the Meitner Act passing and signing. This is from a Senator, Kenneth Mckellar, who said, "Great Britain or Canada did not give us any material aid in discovering this bomb. The work of 25 or 30 British scientists was so inconsequential that the British could not claim a property interest in the formula of the bomb." So he's going down the line of the Netflix movie where it was Einstein said to Roosevelt, make the bomb, and Roosevelt said, yeah, go ahead, make it. Completely airbrushed out all of the work that was done in the UK. It's hard to believe, I think, that Britain would have been excluded from such an act if Churchill had signed a collaboration agreement in 1941 as a partnership of equals. I find it difficult to believe that would have occurred. And the blame clearly lies with Lindeman's arrogance and, I don't know, hubris, I suppose, for thinking that we could do it alone. So I'm just going to, if I can carry on for another 5 or so minutes, I just want to finish the sort of story because to bring it up to the present time. So basically then Britain had to make its own decision about whether to go it alone, independently, making the bomb, making nuclear power and so on. And that then fell to the Attlee government after the end of the war. My own sense, reading, you know, about Attlee, that he was ambivalent about this. You know, I think he was perhaps traditionally, he sort of, you know, he was brought up as part of the British Empire. He had a sort of feeling that Britain was a world power, should be a world power. But on the other hand, he really wanted to focus Britain's limited finances on the development of the welfare state. And my guess is, you know, if it was purely his decision, I don't know this, I'm just surmising from what I've read, that he probably wouldn't have made the decision to build a bomb. But the person that changed everything, persuaded him, was the then Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin. This is his reason why Britain wanted a bomb. Now, it's nothing to do with, the Russians might invade us or something. We need to deter the Russians. This is what he said. We've got to have this bomb. And by the way, before I read this, just think how ironic this is in the light of how Anderson and Lindemann had talked to the Americans just 2 or 3 years before. We've got to have this bomb. I don't mind for myself, but I don't want any other foreign secretary of this country to be talked to at by a Secretary of State in the United States, as I have just had in my discussions with Mr. Burns. We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it. So that carried the day. I believe the decision actually was made somewhat secretly, that the cabinet as a whole wasn't involved in the full decision. But anyway, Bevin's view prevailed. And so Britain did put a large amount of money into spending on nuclear weapons, and it wasn't only, of course, nuclear weapons. We had to build the infrastructure to carry these weapons to whatever country we were going to drop them on. So we had this sort of slightly, I think, bizarre situation in the 50s that we were building these state-of-the-art bombers, whilst at the time when Germany and Japan were industrializing like mad, electrifying their railways and so on, we were still building 19th century steam trains. And the whole thing was put, I think, rather nicely into context by a book which came out in 1980 by Mike Cooley, who said, we have, for example, complex control systems which can guide a missile to another continent with extraordinary accuracy, yet the blind and the disabled have to stagger around our cities in very much the same way as they did in medieval times. So that was a consequence of the decision. So I just want to talk a bit about the 3 people. I didn't actually say, there was an interesting story about how, I should have said this at the time, that Gordon told me about how Bill Hardwick and Robin McElroy had to bring uranium during the Tube Alloys years from Cambridge to Oxford, and they did this on the train. Where everybody else, had their sort of their regular luggage and their shopping from the trip out to Cambridge. They had parcels of uranium. So this is in the days when health and safety perhaps wasn't uppermost in people's minds. But anyway, after the war, the three of them, Bill, Robin and Lewis, all started working at Harwell, which is the UK's Atomic Energy Authority. Now, you know, people think of Harwell as the civil side of the nuclear program. You know, that it was to build reactors that could then power nuclear power stations for providing electricity, whereas all the work on atomic bombs and so on was done down the road at places like Aldermaston and Burfield. And so that was Harwell, by the way, just after the war. That's a picture of Harwell today. It's now a big science park, important science park. But this sort of delineation into civil and military use of nuclear power is really quite fictitious. So in 1956, we opened the first nuclear power station at Calder Hall, which is on the site of Windscale, now what we call Windscale. And a major reason for building this was to make plutonium for bombs. Not only that, the design of the reactor was optimized for plutonium. And Gordon here sent me this email about how even Bill Hardwick, working at Harwell after the war, had not realized this. So Gordon says that then it wrote...
Till the 1980s.
Till the 1980s, okay. It wrote that the whole Magnox program, as we started it, was optimized for nuclear weapons at the expense of fuel costs. Dad, Bill, was absolutely shocked. He'd never wanted to work on bombs after the war, yet he had unwittingly helped to a degree. But a succession of cabinet ministers had been fooled as well, notably Tony Benn, who was Ministry of Technology in the 60s, in charge of the program, and a CND activist. So the wool was very much pulled over people's eyes that these two programs were highly intertwined. So what I want to do, I mean, the thing I've realized, I'm not a historian, but the great thing about a historian is you can ask counterfactual questions. I guess this is what makes history interesting. What would have happened, you know, if the driver that was driving Archduke Franz Ferdinand had only taken a slightly different route back, which he'd been instructed to do, but somehow had forgotten to do that? What would have happened to the rest of the world? So it's an interesting counterfactual. So what would have happened if Lindemann had been a bit more sensible and persuaded Churchill to sign this cooperation agreement back in 1941? Well, okay, I'm just speculating now, but if we had decided, okay, well, we'll let the Americans do most of the work on nuclear bombs, and we'll focus on the civil side of nuclear power, what could they have done? Well, I just want to come back to this diagram I had here, which has the two isotopes of uranium, and just come to the bottom line here. So there's another element called thorium, which has got a slightly fewer protons than uranium, but it's in the same sort of class. Thorium itself, again, is not fissile, but it absorbs a neutron and turns into another isotope of uranium called uranium-233, which is fissile. That was discovered in 1942. So what's the big deal about thorium? Okay, so we're going to come right up to date now. This is the left-hand side is something from Nature less than 1 month ago. Okay, so it's right up to date. China prepares to test thorium-fueled nuclear reactor. So the thing is, this provides a completely new way of generating nuclear energy through the thorium cycle. Why would you want to do that? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is thorium is very plentiful. It's more plentiful than uranium. It's actually very difficult. It's not strictly impossible, but it's very, very difficult to make a bomb out of uranium-233 because it gets contaminated with things which are very hard to separate. It has far, far fewer significant waste products to the uranium-235 cycle, 238, 235 cycle. It can be used in a form of reactor which doesn't need water. When you see this picture here is not actually of a thorium reactor because it has these big concrete containment vessels, and the concrete containment vessels are there to, which wasn't there for Chernobyl, but it should be there to contain an explosion of water into steam. But you don't use water at all. They have what are called molten salt. The fuel is containing what are called molten salts, and these also provide the coolants to these power stations. So this has a number of advantages. You don't need steam, so you don't need containment vessels. Also, it means you can site these power stations away from the coast. This has always been a slight concern of nuclear power stations if you have sea level rise and storm surges and things. But these can be put in fact, this prototype in China, I think, is going to be in the Gobi Desert. So actually, this provides a very interesting, one of the very interesting solutions to climate change, because nuclear reactors don't release carbon dioxide, and this has few of the problems that conventional nuclear reactors have. This never was seriously taken in the past because it couldn't produce, precisely because you couldn't produce a bomb with it, because it wasn't producing plutonium. People weren't interested at the time. But now this is a good reason to go down this route. The main issue with these molten salts is that actually, of corrosion. So the need, I'm going to play it as a pun on words now, but the issue is to find the right alloys that will prevent the molten salts from corroding in the pipes. So my counterfactual, with their expertise on these corrosion problems at Jesus, had they been put onto this problem at Harwell in the 50s, they would have solved this particular tube alloys, literally tube alloys problem. And the UK, rather than China, would today be the world leader in thorium technology. So that's pretty much the end of my story. It's I think, a rather fascinating example of how research actually has enormous global repercussions. And I think, the work that people like Bill and Lewis and Robin did were clearly pioneering work. To my great dismay, because of the arrogance of Lindemann, they weren't able to really benefit from that. And had there been a more open partnership with America, I think they would. But that's where we are today.
Thank you very much.